Today for my lit review, I'm going to be talking about ADHD and its relationship with maternal smoking. So the question I wanted to look at with this lit review is, does smoking while pregnant affect the child's development of ADHD? Basically, if a mother smokes during her pregnancy, is her child more likely to develop ADHD? And if they do develop ADHD, are their symptoms more likely to be severe? Studies in the past have supported the idea of smoking as a risk factor for ADHD, so I wanted to look at this, and I also wanted to look at how smoking impacts the severity of symptoms of ADHD. So I took a look at one study that uses pregnant mice and exposes them to nicotine and measures the behaviors of their child and compares them to typical ADHD symptoms to determine whether prenatal exposure to nicotine is in fact a risk factor for ADHD. Next, after that, the study found that it was in fact a risk factor. After that, I looked at 3 studies that looked at human subjects and with ADHD, and compared the children whose mother did smoke during pregnancy with the symptoms of the child whose mother did not smoke during pregnancy. So these are the studies. These are the studies that I decided to look at. Some key terms that I think are important to get out of the way first is maternal smoking. And for the purposes of this study, maternal smoking is described as when the mothers smoked during their pregnancy for at least 1 month, 10 to 12 cigarettes a day or a pack a day, depending on the study. And it's important to note that maternal smoking in this case only refers to nicotine smoking and does not refer to smoking of any other kinds of drugs. The next one is ADHD, which stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. It is a neurodevelopmental disorder that affects children with symptoms such as inattentiveness, hyperactivity, impulse control, and memory problems, as well as learning problems. So how does this question fit into nature versus nurture? First of all, it deals with the impact of nature and genetics on prenatal development. If smoking is found to affect ADHD, then it supports the idea that an environmental stimulus can affect development during the prenatal stage. And if smoking is found not to affect ADHD, then while not completely disproving the idea, it could be used as evidence against it. So why is this topic so important? On a professional level, it can be used to warn and educate expecting mothers, it can be helped to develop new treatments for ADHD, and can help to identify more kids with ADHD. And on a personal note, I also have ADHD and am interested in the different ways it can be affected and caused. So let's look at some similarities in the studies I've looked at. A first similarity is their definition of maternal smoking. As I've mentioned, it is usually when the mother smokes during pregnancy for over a month, and it is described as smoking a pack a day or 10 to 12 cigarettes a day. Another similarity is the method they use of determining maternal smoking status. In all of the studies that look at it, they simply ask the question, did you during your pregnancy smoke 10 to 12 packs, 1 pack a day or 10 to 12 cigarettes a day, depending on the study, for over a month? And if they answered yes, they were coded as maternal smokers. Another thing I found was the relatively low sample size. In all of these studies, their samples ranged in the low hundreds, with one even getting below 100. And most, but not all, supported the association that maternal smoking is associated with the development of ADHD and severe ADHD. So looking at some of the differences, one of the differences is the kinds of ADHD symptoms that these researchers wanted to measure. Some researchers looked at more physiological symptoms like motor control and coordination, while others looked at more psychological symptoms such as learning and intelligence. Another difference that I mentioned is that one study does not support the association. One study found that there was no noticeable difference between the symptoms of children whose mothers smoked during pregnancy and children whose mothers did not smoke during pregnancy. Another difference that I have mentioned is one of the studies I looked at simply looked at whether maternal smoking was a risk factor for ADHD, while the other 3 while the other three looked at if maternal smoking causes more severe symptoms of ADHD. And the final difference that I noticed is in the way that researchers decided to measure the symptoms of ADHD. Some decided to use structured interviews conducted by experienced clinicians and psychiatrists, and using DSM diagnostic criteria in order to determine the severity of symptoms, while some used more pre-established tests such as the Wechsler scale to measure the symptoms. So some critiques I have. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the low sample size of these studies, especially one that was below 100. One study only had 78 participants, and only 12 of those participants had prenatal exposure to nicotine. And I feel as though having such a low sample size hurts the generalizability of the study, especially when we're dealing with one of the most prevalent mental disorders in children in the US. Another critique I had is the lack of consideration for the father's smoking, as well as for both parents' smoking habits after birth. I think it's important to determine whether or not the parent smoked after birth and whether or not the child was exposed to high amounts of nicotine during their formative years, as this could act as a confounding variable. Another critique I had is that the studies made no attempt to differentiate between boys and girls in their study. It is a well-known fact that children with ADHD, whether they be boys or girls, present differently their symptoms. Boys tend to be more hyperactive and impulsive, while girls tend to be more inattentive. And I feel as though it's important to study how maternal smoking affects both of these groups, because they could affect them differently. Another critique I had is that the study did not consider whether the mothers had ADHD. ADHD is an inheritable disorder, meaning that those who have it can pass it down to their children. And it could be the fact that people with ADHD might be more predisposed to smoking cigarettes. And if that is the case, it could be likely that a mother with ADHD would smoke during her pregnancy and also give birth to a child with ADHD. And this linkage could be due to an overlying genetic factor rather than the association between the two. And finally, these studies chose mostly not to look at genes at all. And I think that's a shame, because I think it's important to look at all the factors when dealing with something like prenatal development, because both genes and environment can have an effect on it, and I think it's important to make sure that when dealing with environmental impact on prenatal development, I think it's important to make sure that there's no genetic factor that's actually playing a role. So some applications. First of all, as I've mentioned before, the answer to this question could pose new treatment methods, such as if smoking is associated with ADHD, it could suggest that children with ADHD whose parents smoke might need more intensive treatments. And if it's not associated, it helps doctors not to waste time examining parental smoking and go on to other risk factors. In terms of prevention, if there is an association, it could help warn parents about and educate them about the dangers of smoking while pregnant and might lower rates of pregnancy smoking. And if there is no association, doctors and researchers, once we nail that down, could start looking towards new risk factors and maybe find something there. And on the broader note, if there is an association, it would support the idea that environmental stimuli can have an impact on prenatal development. So looking towards the future, one thing I'd like researchers to look at is the differences in the impact regarding boys versus girls. As I have mentioned, ADHD presents differently in boys and girls, and it could be the case that maternal smoking also affects them differently, and I think that's an important part to study. I would also like to see larger sample sizes than the ones we've seen in these studies. I think when dealing with as common a disorder as ADHD, I think it's important to get a decent sized sample size in order to generalize correctly. I would also like a more in-depth look at non-ADHD children and how prenatal smoking affects them as well. Because if we find that children without ADHD whose mothers did smoke during pregnancy also show the same deficits in learning and impulse control and other symptoms that we see in ADHD, it could further support the idea that it's prenatal smoking exposure that is the factor at play here. And if they show not to have the same deficits, it could support the idea that there might be some underlying genetic factor concerning the children with ADHD that might be affecting this rather than the prenatal smoking exposure. And finally, I would like a more in-depth look at genes of different groups of children, looking at kids with ADHD whose parents didn't smoke, children without either, children with ADHD whose parents did smoke who were affected and unaffected by it. And I think when dealing with something like this, it's important to get a full look at how this environmental stimuli and how the genetics play to really determine what is the cause. Thank you.